Hello, my name is Niall McKay and welcome to Living with PSC, a podcast about the rare disease of primary sclerosing cholangitis. Now, PSC causes the bile ducts inside and outside the liver to become scarred, narrowed and eventually blocked, and leads to liver cirrhosis. In this podcast, we aim to dispel some of the myths about the disease. Welcome, Nicola Tessier, who is in Boston, and we are delighted to have you on the podcast today. Nicola is a PSCer, if you like, or PSC partner, and also a liver transplantee, or partial liver transplantee. And Nicola, like all heroes or superheroes, you must have an origin story. I wonder if you can tell me your origin story with PSC.
First of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's really nice to be here. I always love sharing my story and seeing if I can help anybody else with a somewhat similar journey. I started my PSC journey back in 2005. I was living out in San Francisco at the time, and I woke up with a really sharp pain in my right side one day, and I was only 21 at the time. I didn't know anything about anything health related really, and I thought, this must be appendicitis. So I took myself to the emergency room, and labs were drawn, and the only thing that came back were elevated liver function tests, which again, I was a young woman who knew nothing about liver function tests. So I was discharged, and the pain shockingly went away. But when I was referred to a gastroenterologist in the San Francisco Bay Area, who ended up performing a liver biopsy and gave me the diagnosis of primary sclerosing cholangitis. And I knew nothing about the disease and thought, that can't be me. Everything I've read online, it's middle-aged men, I'm young, I'm healthy, I barely drink. That's not me. And so I came back to Boston where my original roots are with my family, and I had a second and third opinion, actually, both of which came back with the same diagnosis. So I was asymptomatic for a long time. I was, by this time, with the official diagnosis, I was 22 and really couldn't really believe that was my story, and lived a fairly normal life as a 22-year-old would. I ended up moving back to Boston just to be closer to my family and have my care team here. And slowly over time, I just became more symptomatic. And as every journey of PSC is unique and different, mine was certainly had its ups and downs. There'd be moments where I was totally fine, and then the next moment I'd be admitted. So all those horrific symptoms that you hear a lot about, I unfortunately experienced a lot of them. My transplant story really came to fruition when I was having scans done every 3 months to look for tumors. And every time we would biopsy them, they'd come back negative. But there was always a large risk of cholangiocarcinoma, which is the cancer of the bile ducts that comes, unfortunately, a lot of times hand in hand with PSC.
How long were you asymptomatic for?
I was asymptomatic for a couple of years. Actually. And so nothing changed. But I will say, looking back now, or even waking up post-transplant, the things that, you think were normal back then weren't normal. You thought, oh, geez, I'm tired at 5 o'clock. But, everybody's tired at 5 o'clock because they worked all day. But once I had a new liver in me, I sat back and thought, well, geez, yeah, I was probably more tired than I really should have been, but just when it's your normal every day, you get used to it and convince yourself that there's nothing wrong. So yeah, I enjoyed a couple of years with no symptoms.
Yeah, well, I think the what happens really is that your new normal, it happens very slowly, doesn't it? Gradual change.
Yeah.
That you don't really notice.
Yeah. Actually, my family, during my transplant surgery, my family wrote down a list of all of my quote unquote ailments and things that I would have complained about, or, little things like I would always have a snack with me because I always felt like I had low blood sugar, and all these things, they wrote all of them down. And, a few months after transplant, we revisited the list, and almost all of them I could relate to PSC, and they were all gone. So there's so many symptoms that I feel like aren't really written about too, that a lot of PSC patients have. And I was, proof of that by that massive list that my family wrote.
Well, certainly, yeah. Shall we talk a little bit about some of the symptoms? Because mine kind of started with massive nausea, incredible and incredible tiredness. And then the immediate need to sleep after lunch. But and those things I thought were just normal for a while, but then other symptoms increased, and things like insomnia I didn't even know was a symptom until I was my second year at the conference, I think.
Yeah, I know there are so many. I think the ones that plagued me the most were, I've definitely experienced itching to the extreme. And that by far and most would be, for me, the most brutal symptom. It's relentless. And, my husband describes, when I have an itching episode, would just knows to almost leave me alone, because he wants to help, as does everybody, but there's really just nothing that anybody can do, unfortunately, and it's really miserable, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. So I've definitely experienced the unpleasant itching and the fatigue. I remember running a road race with a couple of friends before transplant and not being able to run it, which was unusual for me, and so I remember having that kind of breakthrough moment where I thought, this is something that I should be able to do. I don't know why I can't do it. And it was really tough for me, not only physically, but mentally, to have to stop and walk. And that was really hard. I also had a lot of esophageal varices, which isn't necessarily, visible on the outside, but that was something that I dealt with a lot via endoscopies and having them banded. And just the kind of side effects that come with that, of kind of feeling kind of nasty afterwards, was never really fun. I was lucky.
Wasn't that acid reflux?
Yes, I definitely had acid reflux. And that's a good example of a symptoms where, I felt like everybody has acid reflux, when they eat something acidic. And I thought it was normal to just, pop Tums every day, until you look back and say, yeah, no, that's not normal. So yeah, I definitely had that as well. I will say the one thing that I was spared of was the jaundice, shockingly enough. I never really turned that kind of banana yellow. But I know that's often common with a lot of other PSCers, but that one, unfortunately, or luckily for me, did not affect me too much. There were moments where I was a little gray, but I never turned yellow.
Yeah, and some people go, well, I go a very healthy looking red or pink. So people are like, oh my God, you look so healthy.
Yes, you're exactly right. Yeah, all colors of the rainbow. We don't discriminate.
They are. And we've talked about itching before, and my strategy is to use extremely hot showers or hot baths.
Yeah.
And what's your one?
Yeah, I remember you saying that, and I honestly can't think of anything worse for me with heat. I've tried it all. I think honestly that the thing that worked for me the most was sitting in ice cold baths, which sounds crazy when you're not itching, but when you're itching, I almost lose temperature senses. And so I could easily get into a freezing cold bath, no problem, because it actually felt better than the itching. So you would take that over the itching any day. And I would sleep with a bucket of ice by my bed, and I would kind of roll over, dunk my feet in the ice, and I'd put a towel at the end of the bed and put my feet on the towel, and then I'd put a fan on my feet. And although I could never sleep because I was cold, I'd rather stay awake all night and have minimal itching than just sit there scratching everywhere on my body all night. And I've tried a lot of the medications, and some help a little bit, but nothing really gets rid of it, unfortunately for me. And I'm lucky in the fact that it comes in waves, so I haven't experienced it continuously. I know some people are plagued with that, and I can only imagine. I'll have it for a week or so, and then I'll get a little break, and then I'll have another for another week and get a little break. So those times when I had it, I would just kind of hibernate until hopefully it broke.
I understand. Yeah. I mean, I don't have it continuously either, although I have a low level of itching continuously. So
yeah,
I can be sitting there and I won't notice it, but people I'm with.
Yeah.
I'm constantly scratching it. Particularly if I get warm or hot. But what seems to happen if I can get my temperature right up, either through exercise or through baths or showers or whatever, then I get some relief afterwards.
Yes, I do. Living in Boston and having the colder months, that's one benefit of having the winter season here is you have a real life ice block outside on your front steps. So there would be times where I would just run outside for a few minutes, scrape my feet on the driveway and come back in, just for a few seconds of relief. And it sounds torturous. And, it really is a form of torture that I hope no one ever has to experience.
The fatigue as well is just, it's very hard to explain to somebody who hasn't. I mean, I think people who've had COVID understand that you get massive fatigue, that it's not just tiredness, it's like debilitating.
Yeah. I'm part of a few different Facebook groups, but one of them is the Facebook group for the younger women. And there's a lot of talk about, you have a certain number of spoons per day. You have to kind of plot out your activities. One spoon might be taking a shower and another spoon might be eating dinner. And if you only have 3 for the day, then, unfortunately you can't make that walk to the mailbox, or you can't, head to the bus stop, just because you have to ration out your energy. And I think that a lot of PSCers deal with that on a daily basis, is trying to manage the amount of energy they have and what they can really do each day. And I definitely had moments too where, I remember post-transplant, we lived in a small apartment in Boston, and I could only go up the stairs once a day. And so I had to make sure I had everything I needed for the day, because I know I couldn't make it up again. It's a good lesson in time management, I guess.
Yeah, no, I understand that too. Yeah, the spoons is a very good way of measuring it, I suppose. But that makes work a little tricky. But you're working full-time, aren't you?
No, I work part-time as kind of a marketing consultant.
Can you tell me what you experienced when you were coming up to transplant? What was happening for you at this stage?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, the need for a transplant for me was heavily driven by the risk of cholangiocarcinoma. So I was having scans regularly and biopsied regularly. And eventually in January of 2009, my transplant team kind of sat me down and said, it's time. We're getting negative biopsy results every time, but soon there's going to be one that's not negative, and then we're going to be in a whole different situation.
Was there some reason that made you more, why were they so worried?
Yes. So I was having scans done every 3 months, and every time we do a scan, there'd be a new tumor that would show up. So we'd biopsy it and kind of cross our fingers that every time we biopsied it, that A, we got the right spot, and B, that it came back negative. And that was really stressful. Obviously, it was a lot going through it physically, because I'd have to be inpatient, and then the risks of biopsy and all that. But mentally, as a young 20-year-old, it was really stressful to have to wait for those biopsy results to come back. They oftentimes can take up to a week. And so that's a really stressful time to wait those few days for that phone call or that email that, it's clear. And so with the just frequency of tumors showing up every 3 months, it just became a much greater risk of cholangiocarcinoma.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's horrendous.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bad enough.
Yeah.
That's horrendous. That's really terrible to be going through. It's really, How did it come about that you got the transplant? Like, were you on a waiting list at the time?
Yeah, so I was, in January 2009, I was put on the waiting list. But as you know, with many PSC patients, your MELD score for a transplant never gets elevated high enough. So Boston has the New England area really in general has a lengthy waiting list. And so to receive an organ, you've got to be at death's door. And so some of my labs never elevated in me. So that didn't help my MELD score. So on paper, I looked less sick than I really was. And so the option of a living donor was a better fit for me. And I was lucky that I'm one of 4 children. And so all of my siblings stepped up, and their spouses and my parents and my then boyfriend, now husband, all stepped up to be tested for a match. And I'm so lucky to have such a large support system, and everyone jumped at the chance. No one even hesitated. But it's amazing how quickly people are ruled out. I have my parents were unfortunately too old to be donors, and I have an identical twin sister, and there was concerns about would the organ just kind of would PSC come right back in the organ, and it was a little too risky. And also, she was a really good mental support person for me, so I don't know that physically it would have been a good match for her to be going through the physical heaviness of a transplant at the same time as me. And my older brother was originally chosen to be my donor. He's taller I'm fairly tall. I'm 5'9", and my brother is 6'4", and so the larger the person, the less of the liver they have to take out, because the liver, as you know, regenerates into the person that's the recipient. But in the final scan, he had a benign lesion, which turned out to be nothing, but it ruled him out. So then my younger brother, who's a little bit smaller but still bigger than me, was chosen as the donor. And I'm so lucky to have two brothers that were matches, and one that actually was able to donate 56% of his liver to me in July of 2009. So it was a very special day for all of us.
And when they say partial liver transplant, don't they mean that it's partial to them, but not partial to you?
Yes, yes, exactly.
So they take out, did they take out your whole liver and part of his, or how does it work?
Yes, they took out his part of his liver, and he kept his bile ducts. And so they put they took my whole liver out and my gallbladder and put his half of his liver into me, and basically man-made, for lack of scientific terms, all of the connections. So it was a lengthy surgery, and I can only imagine, as a mom myself, having, two of my kids in kind of that big of a surgery at the same time. It must have been, an experience of a lifetime. And so, 24 hours later, we both came out, and we had success. So I'm very, very thankful. Despite it being a genetic illness, or a partly genetic illness, if you like, I don't seem to anecdotally know anybody who has family members who have, in PSC Partners, for example, who have PSC. Do you? I don't know anybody. And so I'm an identical twin, so she's always an interesting comparison, because she's the same. Obviously, she's identical. We're the same size, height, everything. And so she's a good baseline for me. If I have a symptom, I kind of call her and say, "Do you have this?" And she says, "Oh yeah, I have that." I'm like, "Okay, and that's normal. Then I'm normal. I'm good." So I'm so lucky to have that proxy. But I'm also lucky that, knock on wood, I'm the only one with the health issues in my family. So I also have ulcerative colitis, and I have some bleeding issues. But while it's unfortunate it's all of me, I'm also grateful that it's me and not everybody else. So I haven't, everyone in my family has continually checked, their labs are drawn and liver function tests, because everyone has a little bit of paranoia in them that, oh gosh, if it happened to Nicola, could it happen to me? But thankfully everyone's always have come back normal. So, are you of Italian descent or Irish descent, or? No, I'm originally from England, actually. I was born outside of Manchester. Do you still have UC, or did the transplant get rid of it? Yeah, I actually didn't get diagnosed with UC until after my transplant. I was transplanted in 2009. I didn't get diagnosed with UC until 2019. Which was somewhat disappointing. I started to have symptoms in 2017, but I thought, it's stress, it's nothing. And then 2019, it didn't matter. I lost 10 pounds without trying. And I just felt like, I was tied to the house a lot. And so that happened fairly quickly. I think, I started having symptoms in March, and I was diagnosed in June. And I probably should have gone in sooner. I just, you don't want to ever think anything's wrong with you. So you kind of put it off. And every time I'd feel unwell, the next day I'd feel fine. So I thought, it's just in my head. It went away. I'm fine. So I'm lucky that I'm currently in clinical remission, and I'm on Remicade, which has been a lifesaver for me. So although I have ulcerative colitis, I don't feel it every day. Thankfully, thanks to the biologics that I'm on.
I mean, there's about 80% of PSCers that have UC, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or Crohn's. It's another little gift that the disease
keeps on giving, doesn't it?
And how have you been post-transplant?
I've been well. I've been really well. I'm not, without a few bumps here and there, but I feel like it's fairly uncommon to be post-transplant and not have a couple of bumps. And I don't think that's shared as much as I think it should be when you face a transplant, because you're treating one set of problems. And I hate to say problems because that's probably not the right word, but you're trading one set of issues for a slightly different life, right? So there's obviously a lot of medications that you take post-transplant, which have their own side effects. And since I had a living donor surgery, a lot of the connections, if you will, were made, and so by the surgeons. And so being a young 26-year-old at the time of transplant, your body is, quote unquote, healthy. And so additional scar tissue would tend to build up around where, all of my bile ducts were connected. And so I've had a few drains just because of the scar tissue been built up, not from the disease itself, but just as a kind of natural progression of the surgery, which I know that, that happens occasionally with living donors, not so much with cadaver organs. But, I've had a few drains that have been in for, 6 weeks to 6 months. And a couple of them were not particularly pleasant, but, I've had a couple that haven't really bothered me too much. So, I'll take those in trade for being here. But I have 2 healthy young boys, which are blessings on earth. And I wouldn't have been able to have them if I didn't have a transplant. So that's my biggest silver lining of the whole process. And
was that complicated at all by the fact that you'd had a transplant?
My oldest son, who's 8, Ben, I carried him myself, and I had an amazing pregnancy. I felt like $1 million. I was that woman that if you told me I could have 10 children, I would have signed up right then and there. I loved it. I felt great. My liver numbers were perfect. I had no complications whatsoever. Had a wonderful birth. And then 3 months after he was born, I ended up having needing to have a drain placed. My liver enzymes skyrocketed and I needed a drain. So I had a drain, but I had some complications with that. They required another few abdominal surgeries. And so the team kind of sat me down and said, I don't know that a second pregnancy would be a great idea for you. So I'm incredibly fortunate that I had a friend that offered to carry a second child for us. So our second child was born via, the technical name is a gestational carrier because it was our biology and her body. So I was incredibly fortunate to have a friend that stepped up to do that for us. So no, our second son was born via surrogate. Which is a whole topic for, another podcast. But I have to say, PSC patients, where there's a will, there's a way. And so my husband and I really wanted more than one child. They're just the light of our lives. So, we met with the team and we're kind of thinking about all the different options. You can adopt, you can have a surrogate, you could choose to just have one child. There's a million choices. And so we kind of investigated them all and we're lucky enough to have a surrogate available for us. So.
Wow. Yeah. That's extraordinary.
Yeah. Speaking of never being able to thank someone enough, and now I have to thank my brother for the organ, multiple people for blood transfusions, and then, a friend for carrying a child for me. I mean, my Christmas present list is quite lengthy these days.
Yeah, well, these are wonderful gifts.
Yes.
You had a number of transfusions as well, other than the surgery or other times? No,
during the transplant, I didn't actually have any blood transfusions, which is, fairly rare for a transplant. I did really well during that surgery. The time I needed a few transfusions was after my son Ben was born. I ended up back in the hospital a few months later for that drain. I ended up having some issues with an artery on my side that caused lots of bleeding. So I ended up having a thoracotomy and a drain, and lots of blood was needed. So
Did you get sepsis at all, or were you okay from that
I didn't
point?
get sepsis then. I've had sepsis quite a few times since transplant, just from that's kind of the conundrum that I have post-transplant. I think you and I have talked about, antibiotics multiple times. But the long and the short of it is, I'll have scans and everything looks fine, and then I'll end up really ill. And so when I go into the emergency room, they, after blood's drawn, bacteria will grow and end up being, a blood infection. And so we're always puzzled about, our original thinking was maybe there's a blockage and that's causing things to back up, but there's nothing that shows up on a scan. So it's either there is a blockage and it's too small to show up on a scan, or something else is going on that's just literally microscopic. So I'm currently on rotating antibiotics, and I have been for over a year now. And we're going to come off them and see what happens. But with all this COVID and Omicron, we decided to hold out for a couple more months to let that kind of settle down a bit, because we don't need to be in the hospital with a blood infection and then have that on top of it. So
My gastroenterologist said to me was that anytime he takes people off the rotating antibiotics, he regrets it.
yes.
So it's a very tricky thing.
Yes. I know, a lot of patients pre-transplant are also on kind of long-term antibiotics, and it's a hot topic in a lot of the webinars and conversations that, we all are a part of. And it's a tricky one. You can see both sides. I also, until you come off and have, culture done, it's hard to know if you have resistance. And that's, the big buzzword that we want to try and avoid when we talk about antibiotics. So it's a challenge. And I've been lucky that I felt really good on them. So, I'm hesitant myself to come off them, but I also am aware of the damage that they can do if you're on them long term. So, yeah.
How did you feel taking the during COVID? Were you worried about getting COVID with the immunosuppressants? Or?
Yes. I think, that brought anxiety to a new high. I think we, in the beginning of COVID, no one really knew anything, and everything shut down. And, the day everything shut down, you realize, wow, this is a big deal. And it definitely elevated my anxiety across the board. And having, two children that, I know love school and want to be surrounded by friends and their teachers and classrooms, which unfortunately are full of germs. It's a challenge for people like us, but it's also a really great lesson to teach kids and especially our children, how they have to be diligent to protect people like their mom. And so, I feel like my kids have learned a lot of compassion from the whole process of understanding, well, I'm going to wear a mask because it's going to protect me, but also because I'm trying to protect my mom. And I think one of the larger messages that we all think about when we think about COVID is, it's not about you, it's about everybody else. And everyone has to do their part to help protect people like me.
Yeah, and from what I can tell, I've been, I'm on, a WhatsApp group with Irish transplantees. A number of them did get COVID and were fine,
Yeah.
But they were vaccinated and triple vaccinated and all that.
Yes.
The problem for us was that we got, which was the AstraZeneca vaccination, which wasn't apparently quite as efficient as the Pfizer one. So
it's interesting. I've actually had 4 vaccines now. I'm part of a couple of different clinical trials that have allowed me to, I should say research trials that have allowed me to have my antibodies tested. And so I'm able to see, and for a while we didn't know what that number meant. We don't know what the right number is, how high should your antibody level be. And so, I met with the team end of December, and they kind of said to me, you're not you think you're doing well, but you're not as high as you should be. So you should consider getting another dose. So I've actually had 4 full doses, and I'm proud to report that my antibody levels are quite high. So my behavior hasn't changed at all, but it's been kind of an anxiety reliever knowing that I am protected as much as I can be. And then that there's also, antibody infusions available should I need it. So it's definitely we're in a better place than we were in the beginning of 2020, but still have a ways to go.
You still get symptoms from time to time now, and how do you manage the disease?
Yeah, I would say 97% of the time I live a very normal life. Like I said, I have 2 young boys. I'm very active and I work part-time and feel like a normal person. I do suffer from kind of the infections that will hit me very quickly. And I know you experience this too. So
Absolutely,
thankfully,
yeah.
I haven't had them when I've been on the oral antibiotics, but typically, I'd be fine. And then an hour later, I would be 104 temperature, shivering uncontrollably, vomiting, and just very, very sick, and would need to get to the hospital as soon as possible to kind of start receiving IV antibiotics. And so that's really hard especially with 2 young kids at home, because my husband works full time. And so all of a sudden I go from being a completely functioning parent to I'm completely useless. And now he's got to try and manage the job and the kids and the house. And it's a lot, as well as worry about me, because every time I go in, I cross my fingers that it's going to be treated with kind of IV antibiotics, but there's always a chance that maybe it won't be able to, and I'll end up needing some surgery or something. And it's a little bit of the unknown. And so but it's also a really good reality check when it does happen. I think, there's no better way to feel grateful for the life that you have than to have it taken away from you for a minute. And so every time I have been admitted, I come home and I'm so much more thankful for my warm bed and my husband and my family and just nice food and being able to have food when I want it. And there's, it's unfortunate that we have to have a hospital admission to realize, all the positive things you have in your life. And so I try and have a little bit more awareness of, not to be cliche, but how good life is when you're having a good day. And sometimes it takes those bad ones to realize how good the good ones are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the thing that happens to me when I get ill is that I don't remember anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So what are the things that you do to remain healthy or to stay healthy on a daily basis?
Yeah, like you, I do watch what I eat. I'm a firm believer of everything in moderation, but I do tend to stay away from, I don't eat red meat, and I haven't eaten it for a number of years because that never really agreed with me. And I eat a pretty vegetable and low kind of lean protein diet that I've always done. That's not really even been post-transplant, but I just believe that's what makes me feel good. I run almost every day as well and do kind of HIIT workouts and interval training. So that's a big part of my life. And I try and do that every day. And I think not only it makes me feel better physically, but it's also gives me kind of some mental sanity to try and, get some of that energy out. And I also have 2 young kids 2 boys that love sports. So I'm continually chasing after them and a ball somewhere.
How about stress? Do you try to manage stress at all, or?
I do. And, I feel like as you get older, you do get wiser. And I think there are things that used to stress me a lot more when I was younger than they do now. And, I try and take those moments of the really hard times in my life and pour them into every day to know that, today's a good day. Like we have nothing to complain about. I do a lot of journaling. It sounds really, really morbid, but I have a book that I write to whoever. I keep it as almost like a journal that if something were to happen to me, I've written everything down that I could possibly ever want to tell somebody. And that's been a huge reliever for me. So, and it probably sounds silly listening to it, but just, I hope nobody would ever read it, right? The goal is that no one will ever have to read it. But if something does happen to me and, someone does have to read it, that they'll know everything that I've ever thought or wanted to say to somebody, and it leaves some kind of memory for them. And it helps me knowing that, I've put everything down that I possibly could have. And it's once it's on the paper, it's out of my head. And so that's been a massive help for me. So I'm a big believer in kind of writing stuff down.
I can cure myself. Well, I know I can't cure myself with lack of stress and good food and exercise. But I do know I could probably eat myself sick, and there are things I could do to be a lot sicker, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, it is hard too when you have the moments of weakness and you're not feeling well to sit back and reflect and try and blame yourself for, oh, well, I shouldn't have eaten that extra chocolate, or I shouldn't have eaten that. But, you'll drive yourself crazy having those thoughts. So, what will be, and just trying to focus on either how to get yourself out of the hospital or get yourself feeling better is where I try and spend my energy. And, I typically, once I'm feeling well enough in the hospital, but I'm admitted for a few days, I will walk as many laps as I possibly can around, and every day try and beat my day before. And, if I feel good enough to walk, well, I'm going to walk, And so I think it's sad to say that PSC gives us a good perspective on life, but it certainly does.
Yeah, well, gratitude does seem to go a long way, I suppose. And I have to say, one of the things I'm most grateful for is finding people like you. People
that speak your language and understand where you are is, tremendous value. Yeah. I know the PSC conferences I haven't been to a few recently just because of obviously the pandemic, and then I've had young children and lack of childcare, but they've been, every time I've gone, I've left so energized and validated. And I always say to everyone that's been newly diagnosed, really try and make an effort to get to those. It sounds intimidating, but they're just so valuable. And I know you're not part of the females 20s and 30s group, but that's also an incredible support system. The women in that group are unlike any other people. They're really angels on earth, and they're so supportive of everybody. And most of them have never met, and the relationships that they have, it's so kind and compassionate, and we could all learn a little bit from all of those people.
Well, it's been fantastic talking to you, Nicola. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
It's great chatting with you.
Thanks. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week. For more information about PSC and for a list of people and topics we'll be covering in the near future, please go to www.pscpartners.org. That's www.pscpartners.org. PSC Partners is a non-profit organisation dedicated to providing education and support to primary sclerosing cholangitis patients. There is information and resources on the website. There is a conference once a year. There is a private Facebook group that you can also join. Also, please join our patient registry. This is an anonymous database that provides research support to the medical community who are researching this disease. Thank you very much for listening.